The fact that we have this discussion and it comes from two very, very different, both chronological and to an extent cultural perspectives, is going to be valuable. This is a subject where the answers are not in the back of the textbook. This is a subject where the quality of your answer is determined by the quality of your research and the validity and the logic of your argument.
That's an excerpt from today's episode, which I sat down with Bruce Dennett to talk about the JFK Case Study in the new History Extension course. We focused our discussion on the man and the myth debate within that case study and tried to explore a range of different historical interpretations and also talk about the exam at the end a little bit as well. This is a slightly different episode today. It's not so much an interview, but a discussion between two history teachers about their different views of JFK and the JFK case study. And it is also primarily aimed at students who are preparing or revising for this particular topic. I'd also like to quickly point out that there is a shorter version of this discussion available in the March 2019 edition of our quarterly journal, Teaching History. Thanks for joining us again on the podcast of the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. Remember, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and SoundCloud, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Okay, Bruce Dennett, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
We're here to talk about JFK and the new iteration of the History Extension case study for JFK. But before we do that, let's talk about ourselves a bit in terms of JFK historiography. Why don't you give us a bit of a rundown on how you're positioned with this?
Aside from the fact that normally any presentation I start with is with a warning, trust no one, especially me, you need to bear in mind that my context is I remember where I was when the news came through that JFK had been shot.
Which was where?
In Dallas. At Bellevue Hill Bowling Green. And everything about that struck me as remarkable, but not as unusual as it was dealt with in the media. Because I was then, as I am now, a history nerd, I was conscious that a number of other American presidents had been assassinated, and there had been a number of attempts, unsuccessful, on American presidents in quite recent past history. Therefore, as I looked at the Kennedy legacy, I was impressed with the media coverage of the man, but still fundamentally cynical, as all good historians and history students need to be. Back to my initial statement, trust no one. The first thing historians need to do is verify sources, verify assertions, based on other evidence and based on whether the argument is logical. The other way I tended to view, and the other lens through which I viewed JFK, was the fact that I'm a Newcastle-born working-class boy who has always been sympathetic to left-of-centre politics. Therefore, in an Australian incarnation, I would always be inclined to support the broad policies of the Australian Labor Party. In an American context, and I wrote this in an article once for the HTA, were I an American citizen, I would have consistently voted for Democratic presidential candidates. There is not one Republican in the period at which I was of a voting age where I would have ever voted for a Republican, especially now.
So that's an obvious point of contrast between you and I, in the sense that I don't have living memory of these events because I was born in 1983, and I came to this largely through American history and through, I would say, broader sweeps of that too. So more foreign policy, meta-analysis of American foreign policy. that was quite popular at the time that I entered university in 2002. And we were arguing about books like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man, and Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. And the whole discussion that we were having in those early 2000s was around American foreign policy in relation to George W. Bush, so Iraq, Afghanistan, and that obviously led back to things like Vietnam and other, foreign policy ventures of the United States. And so I suppose the way I began to think about this when I started to look at Kennedy in particular is that I'd already had a fairly strong set of assumptions built around American foreign policy and what presidents tend to do and what they can and can't do, and how the sort of, I suppose, the broader sweep of American history in terms of those more negative events, you might say. So I think for me, it was a process of not wrestling with my personal memory, but wrestling with big questions of foreign policy and whether, to what degree Kennedy fit in, or to what degree he sort of bucked those trends. It was those sorts of issues that I had to deal with in coming to JFK. So I think I probably, to be quite blunt about it, I think I probably had a fairly negative assumption about what the president would be doing.
Yeah, I think the fact that we have this discussion, and it comes from two very, very different, both chronological and to an extent cultural perspectives, is going to be valuable. This is a subject where the answers are not in the back of the textbook. This is a subject where the quality of your answer is determined by the quality of your research and the validity and the logic of your argument. Can I make a point to anybody listening out there that you are for now and forever excused for making any mistakes about Kennedy and the man and the myth, because both Fukuyama and Huntington were both based on what is now seen to be false premises. So you've got an escape clause.
Well, that's good to know, yeah. All right, so let's start trying to talk about this case study in a bit more of a particular sense now that we've set some of that context. What we're interested in talking about, I suppose, as the centerpiece of this discussion is the man and the myth debate. There is a change in the syllabus here, with a change from 5 possible debates in the old syllabus. Now we've narrowed it down to 3. And in the JFK case, we've got Cuba / Khrushchev, we've got Indochina, and we've still got the man and the myth. So 3 debates that have been there all along. But I suppose it's worth pulling out the man and the myth debate and talking about it, because I think it's an often misunderstood, and often people shy away from this debate for some reason, and I'm a little bit perhaps saddened by that. How do you understand that debate, this man and the myth debate?
It's not all about Trixie and Bubbles, Fiddle and Faddle, and all the stuff about JFK and his tendency to womanize. There was a time back when I was involved in the marking process where occasionally you would get both candidates and markers react to the man and the myth as being something that was insignificant and that it was basically gossip. And they would then steer towards what they saw as the more serious debates. The reality is, however, that the man and the myth debate was then and is now really important. It's how we make judgments about that period of history and about the role of leaders and leadership, and even how we view changes in the American presidency. The other advantage, simply from a utilitarian point of view, is quite simply this. If you deal with the man and the myth, you have to, in some way, touch on and acknowledge both Cuba and Indochina, regardless of how you feel one way or the other about JFK. Can I boil the man and the myth down to a simple question? And this is for everybody out there to make their own decision. And you and I might have slightly different points of view on it, but it is this. Was JFK more substance or more image? Was he more substantial or was he purely style?
And there's a consensus, I would call it that anyway. There seems to be a consensus among historians that there is no doubt that there was an element of JFK's presidency that was or has become myth. The question is, to what extent is there substance within that myth? Would that be a correct kind of observation, do you think?
I'd even come back and start to take issue with those words. There may well be people out there who believe in the tooth fairy. There are people out there who don't accept the idea of climate change. I cannot be held responsible for what fairies exist or do not exist at the bottom of their intellectual gardens. In the case of JFK, I go back to Theodore Sorensen's book, published in 1969, that talked about the Kennedy legacy. In that, Sorensen wrote that legacy is not myth. I don't think that Kennedy is or was myth. I think what Kennedy left as part of his legacy, using Sorensen's words, was a body of political philosophy that was intellectual substance. So intellectual and substance are not mutually exclusive. Legacy and myth are.
So I'd argue something a little bit different, and perhaps maybe even choose some different words, or a different word, and that is that perhaps he's not a myth, but that he has been mythologized. And I'd argue that we see that mythologizing across a whole range of different cultural products, books, films, whatever Kennedy has been represented in. There have been examples of that, or we could pick examples of that where he's been mythologized in a way. And what I simply mean by that is that I think there are parts of his person, there are parts of his character that have been exaggerated and others downplayed for the purposes of making him appear better than he actually was. And I wouldn't argue that he was a bad president or a bad human being necessarily, but I would argue that there has been exaggeration taking place by people who have tried to secure a certain version of JFK.
This is the case in history all the time. If you stand in front of the ticket counter at the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, that has been bounced from Cape Canaveral name to Cape Kennedy to back to Cape Canaveral, there is on the wall an inscription, and it's from one of Kennedy's speeches. Now, you could argue that that's part of the mythologizing process, and I would listen to your argument, and then I would point out that it is what Kennedy said. I would point out that the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral is still called the Kennedy Space Center because it was Kennedy who proposed to the American people the challenge of space exploration. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, he left a physical imprint that was the direct consequence of a program initiated by the Kennedy administration. That is not a myth.
I wouldn't argue that there is no substance to put it in your words, that there's no substance to what Kennedy did and that there is no legacy. I wouldn't argue that at all. We're talking really sort of about, I suppose, a spectrum or a series of, a gradation here about how much myth and how much substance and on what particular issues, perhaps, I think.
What we're talking about is how different people have appropriated Kennedy. Now, this is the point. There is the actual Kennedy legacy. There is the JFK presidency. There is the man and the myth, and it's how we unpack it. Now, look, even Kennedy's most intimate supporters and family members were part of the entire process of branding JFK. JFK and his father were part of branding JFK, and this came from the very first time that the Kennedy family sponsored John Hershey's Reader's Digest article about PT 109. Now, that came out because old Joe Kennedy worked and lobbied really, really hard for his second son to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. He couldn't put that over the top. He got the Navy Star instead, but even more importantly, he got the Reader's Digest article. Kennedy was branded from day one. Kennedy was being marketed from day one. Why? Because he was a politician. And as a pragmatic politician, you only get to do things if you are in office.
How did that brand grow? We've got examples from the very earliest days of his, attempts to enter politics and so on through the media. Absolutely. What other sources of the branding are there at this point? So let's say we're talking really about the 1950s here.
During the 1950s, let's not forget Profiles in Courage. Now, again, this is a classic example of a piece of evidence that is being appropriated. The same way that whether you favour or disfavour JFK, your perspective is appropriated. Okay, let's look at it. 1. Critics of JFK have repeatedly argued, and this is in both books by the Reeves, this is in Seymour Hersh's The Dark Side of Camelot, that JFK didn't really write Profiles in Courage. And repeatedly they keep coming to Ted Sorensen saying, you really wrote this, didn't you? Now, the fact of the matter is that this claim that Kennedy didn't really write Profiles in Courage appears in a radio show by Drew Pearson back in the 1950s. But you need to think about what makes authorship of a book. Is the editor the author? Or is the author the author? If I handwrite a version of one of my textbooks, if I have the idea for one of my textbooks, if I provide chapter outlines for my textbooks, and I write the draft, am I the author of that textbook, or should that acknowledgement go to the editor? If we then investigate further and you ask me, Dennett, did you write that book? And I say yes. If you then go to one of my editors and say, did you write that book? And they say no, I would submit to you that that's conclusive evidence that I'm the author of the book. In the case of Profiles in Courage, JFK, and in the JFK library you can see his handwritten notes for Profiles in Courage. Number 2, the person who is meant to be, according to the Conservatives, the real author is Ted Sorensen, and he said, no, I did not write that book. I think it's conclusive.
So we've got this book that he's written, Profiles in Courage, and this is obviously a kind of tip of the hat to these politicians he sees as demonstrating great political courage in the face of obstacles and so on. Yep. So this is part of his branding in that he's trying to position himself in that tradition, and then he uses his political career to try and present that.
Look at the way it works. You've got PT 109, Reader's Digest, War Hero, Warrior. You've got Profiles in Courage, wins the Pulitzer Prize in 1957, about political courage. He's an intellectual warrior. And that's perfect. You've got a guy with brains, you've got a guy with moral and physical courage. Compare that to the current US president, who unfortunately couldn't go to Vietnam because he had bone spurs.
And then after this book is published, so in the late 50s, he's obviously thinking towards having a run for the presidency. He's
begun running for the presidency from the time he almost got the vice presidential nomination in 56.
So what are the other sources of the branding from this point on after Profiles in Courage? We've got the, people would often throw into the mix here things like Arthur Schlesinger's political pamphlet in 1960 during the election campaign.
They can throw that into the mix, but to be perfectly honest, with due respect to Schlesinger, who was one of the great American historians, did not always write like a great American historian. And let's be honest, that pamphlet, and I would not dignify it with the term book, that pamphlet was a campaign biography. And campaign biographies had been a tradition of American politics going back to the era when presidential candidates would not actually go out and campaign. They would stay at home and wait to be nominated. I don't think that pamphlet had any more impact on the Kennedy brand than any other campaign pamphlet. So I don't see it competing with the likes of Kennedy's television appearances as running for senator for Massachusetts. And a whole lot of people, and again, in 2017, Thomas Olyphant, a journalist, wrote a book about the road to Camelot and about JFK's 4-year campaign for the presidency following his failure to win the vice presidential nomination in 1956. And Kennedy was travelling around the country, taking speaking engagements, and above all, lifting his popular media profile, especially through television. That's far more powerful than a campaign pamphlet.
Okay, so let's fast forward then a bit. Obviously, once he is elected and he becomes president, he can use that position to carry forward the brand. That's obvious enough. How about after he dies? What happens to the brand at this point, in your view?
Look, the nation's in grief. The nation's in grief. The nation's in shock. I have occasionally had to deal with arguments in relation to the man and the myth that we've talked about before, that says the only reason that Kennedy is remembered in such a positive way is this sort of sense of Greek tragedy, of hubris, he died in his prime, etc., etc. Again, it's the same thought I had as a kid when I heard news of Kennedy's assassination, where on the media people were shocked and surprised, this sort of thing doesn't happen. That only happened for people with no awareness of American history. Let me come back to that. No awareness of American history. In reality, out of all the presidents assassinated since Lincoln in 1865, Lincoln became a legend because Lincoln represented ideas and the spirit of America that left a legacy. Notice I separate the word legacy from myth. Okay? There's not a Lincoln myth. Okay? There might be people out there who attempt to mythologize Lincoln, and in doing so, the same way that people who attempt to mythologize Kennedy do both presidents a disservice. In 1881, James Garfield was assassinated. Hello out there, has anyone heard of James Garfield? Reason, he's not famous because he didn't leave anything substantial behind. Then you get William McKinley in 1901. He's not famous either, even though he was assassinated in office. Reason, he didn't leave anything substantial behind, and in fact his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, got onto Mount Rushmore. Presidents are famous who leave enduring legacies. JFK left an enduring legacy.
I wouldn't argue with a portion of that. And the portion that I would accept and agree with is that there are things that JFK represented that did leave a legacy. How I would push back against that, perhaps, is by suggesting that there are some differences between JFK's assassination and some of those assassinations that you talked about before. Let's take McKinley as a good one, because I think the critical difference that I would see there is two things. One is the nature of the media representation of the event. And we know that there was lots of mass media representation of McKinley, and he survived for, 2.5, 3 months. So there's this national, it's on the news all of the time. It's a very traumatic experience, I think, for America. But the difference is that JFK, we have a Zapruder film. We don't have a Zapruder film equivalent for McKinley. And I think there's a difference in quality there, that it's an absolutely shocking piece of footage, and it still has the power to shock. We don't have that footage for other presidents. And the second argument I'd put forward to maybe challenge this idea that the assassination maybe, you're not saying it doesn't mean anything, but didn't mean as much as some people would argue, is that The people that follow these presidents are crucial, and you've just used a good example there. So Teddy Roosevelt follows McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt's this larger-than-life figure. And, I wonder what would have happened to JFK's memory had he been followed not by a Lyndon Johnson, but by a Teddy Roosevelt.
That's where you've got it wrong. Lyndon Johnson was a larger-than-life figure. Again, if you go to the Johnson Presidential Library, and of course, because I'm a nerd, I have, there is one entire wall that is literally 30 feet high, and I'm now going to change the system of measurement because this is how I remembered it, and 20 metres wide. And that entire wall, 2 stories worth, is full of all the legislation passed by Johnson to create the Great Society. Had it not been for the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson would have been seen as one of the great American presidents. Don't trust me on this. Have a look at Robert Dallek. Dallek didn't only write about Kennedy in An Unfinished Life. Dallek started his career by writing about Lyndon Baines Johnson. So Kennedy is followed by another dynamic president who wins the 1964 election with a record landslide. And yet, the Kennedy legacy remains untarnished.
However, and I absolutely agree. I've always thought that about Lyndon Johnson in terms of his productivity as a president, unquestionable. But for some reason, and it's got a lot to do with Vietnam, or for some reasons, Lyndon Johnson does not enter the public memory in the long term in the same way that Teddy Roosevelt does. And I guess that's my point, is that had Lyndon Johnson been remembered much more fairly, and you look at the polls on this, I mean, American historians tend to rate Lyndon Johnson much more highly than the American public. American public rates him fairly average, and American historians tend to think he was great, I suspect because they see the productivity that many people don't see. And my point would be that I suppose to take the McKinley Roosevelt example, that had Lyndon Johnson been remembered in the same way as, say, a Teddy Roosevelt, then maybe Kennedy's memory would have been quite different. I'm just posing that as a counterfactual, I suppose.
Yes, and I think as most counterfactuals work, it's an interesting intellectual exercise, but it's actually contradicted and defied by the evidence of history.
We can agree to disagree on that one then, perhaps. Let's keep going then. So that's there is a debate around the assassination and its role in this memory. There are obviously other people and other groups who pick up the brand and carry it forward. I'd argue Jackie plays an important role here, Jackie Kennedy. I would argue whether they wanted to or not, Schlesinger and Sorensen contributed to elements of the branding that were carried forward. And let me tighten that up by saying that they at least didn't push back against some of the things in the early days that they could have pushed back against in terms of the...
No, how often, if somebody wants to say nice about a member of your family, you go, oh no, he was a ratbag. Look, so that's human nature. But again, that's part of the smokescreen that has hidden, obscured from view, where myth and legacy are not the same thing. And if you want to go to that, it's not an ego thing. There was real political rivalry and tension within the Democratic Party between the Northern Democrats of the likes of Kennedy and his younger brother Bobby and Lyndon Johnson. There is a famous account of ongoing animosity between Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And there were people immediately in the Kennedy camp that were positioning Bobby for a run at the presidency in 1968. If he could share and he could be part of the Kennedy legacy, and maybe even where it folds over into myth, that could only advantage. Now, you mentioned at the start that we had things like the man and the myth. We had relations with Khrushchev, Cuban Missile Crisis. The evidence is that Bobby was far more hawkish towards Cuba. But that when William Manchester wrote his famous 1967 The Death of a President, that according to Michael Hogan, Jackie heavily influenced and pushed back on. The reality is that Manchester writes a good book, but really the pushback comes from Bobby. Because if you look at the records of ExComm, the executive committee put in charge, and again, that's another plus for Kennedy. Kennedy is smart enough to realise in the Cuban Missile Crisis he needs an ExComm because people will not often speak frankly in front of the president. That's an example of leadership. That's a tangible example of leadership. It's not Schlesinger waxing lyrical. It's not Sorensen getting carried away. It's a demonstrable historical fact. Okay? But the version of Bobby that comes out of Cuba is adjusted in retrospect. It is adjusted in hindsight, not to add luster just to JFK, but to give a credible basis for Bobby for a run for the presidency in 68. The more you know, the more intricate and subtle and sophisticated and complicated it gets.
Okay, let's keep going then. After this period, let's say, because we know Bobby is assassinated obviously in 1968, then there are, in the later sort of 90s even, you've got films about Kennedy that come out. Do you think they play an important role in carrying forward the brand?
This is part of, I think I wrote a previous article for the HTA, having a look at JFK through, one of them was called, I think, the media paradigm. And I think that's even more important. Kennedy was profoundly telegenic. There are arguments that the decisive moment in the 1960 election against Nixon was the televised debate, the first of its kind. There are disputes over that, interestingly enough. At the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston on the East Coast, the debate was decisive. At the Nixon Library in Los Angeles on the West Coast, it was not decisive. Trust no one. But the point is that the movies made about Kennedy, and even Jimmy Dean's song that got into the top 10 about PT 109, and the two movies about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's go further. Aaron Sorkin's An American President. Michael Douglas plays a Kennedy-style president. The films about the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, presents an image. There is no chance that classrooms, there is no chance that conservative columnists, there is no chance that academic historians can put a dent in that. Now, that's not Dennett's opinion. Let's go back to evidence. 1, since Arthur Schlesinger's father, Arthur Meyer Schlesinger Sr., started putting together a poll of American academic historians on the greatest presidents, JFK has been ranked in the middle. Every Harris and public opinion poll, every Gallup poll of great American presidents have ranked JFK in the top 3. Washington, Lincoln, Kennedy. And quite frankly, they get it wrong because FDR should be at the top. And beware my bias.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a consistent message that comes through, is that academic historians definitely rate Kennedy as far more average, not bad, but far more average than even people like Lyndon Johnson, as we were saying before. And I think that's an important point there. So there is definitely a sense in which this brand has somehow lodged itself in American culture, and it's very difficult for even, I think, popular sources to do any damage to this. You've got academics trying to dislodge it, and they're obviously failing, and you've got popular history sources trying to dislodge it, and they're obviously failing too. So there's no debate there or disagreement that there certainly has been. This is a powerful brand that is an enduring idea. Let's talk a bit further then about Schlesinger. And what I want to do here, for particularly the students who are thinking about history extension, is to try to think about this in terms of what you're actually doing with these sources. You're not just reading about them. You're not just sort of summarizing their views. The way that the syllabus puts it, and I quote, is we're looking at how and why historical debates have developed from different perspectives and approaches over time. So let's talk about Schlesinger's perspective and approach and try to unpack that. How do you explain his interpretation?
I think Arthur Meyer Schlesinger Jr.'s book, The 1000 Days, would not be seen by him as his finest work. And I think you mentioned, when we were talking about this earlier, that in later editions, he actually admitted that. One, in fairness to him, he says it's not meant to be a history, it's a memoir. In fairness to him, if you read the introduction, it's intended to provide notes that later historians will build on. He's been brought into the Kennedy White House as one of the best and the brightest. That's got to be profoundly flattering, even for a Harvard academic. This is someone whose father was a great historian before him. This is someone who has reached one of the academic pinnacles in the United States. I mean, there's Stanford, there's Columbia, there's Harvard, okay? There are others, but they are part of the Alps. He's written a 3-volume biography of FDR. Great study, okay? Landmark work. And yet he comes into the White House and he sheds all that academic credibility, he sheds that prestige, and he is brought in, and frankly he is used by the Kennedys as a speechwriter and as window dressing and as a functionary. And to some extent, the 1000 Days is a catharsis. In some ways, the 1000 Days is post-traumatic stress, but it is not his greatest work. And as we've talked about before, he wanted approval. And in that sense, the Schlesinger who wrote that book is not the Schlesinger who is the great FDR scholar.
Here's a quote that I want to read to you by Schlesinger's sons, who wrote the introduction to a collection of his letters that I have. And I would argue that this speaks to a deep part of what he's doing in 1000 Days as well. And they're not commenting on 1000 Days here, but I think it speaks to it. They say, and I quote, "He was an ardent New Dealer." This is Arthur Schlesinger, an ardent New Dealer, that is a liberal. The battles of the 30s shaped his politics, loyal to the Democratic Party and recognition of the political short-sightedness, stupidity and greed of American business leadership sat at the heart of his philosophy.
Schlesinger came late to the Kennedy camp. He was initially supporting the likes of Hubert Humphrey, a legitimate lifelong liberal Democrat. Kennedy, by many, including Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Truman, was seen as far too conservative and almost close to the likes of a liberal Republican like Nelson Rockefeller. For many Americans of that branch of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party and that philosophy, JFK wasn't conservative enough. Sorry, wasn't liberal enough. He was too conservative. But he changed. And a more liberal, like Bernie Sanders, probably could not have got elected in 60 because there'd have been too much pushback from the conservative Democrats in the South, especially the Dixiecrats, and put two and two together. Why does Kennedy pick a conservative Southerner as his running mate to balance the ticket?
I would also throw into the mix here a strong element, at least by the time Schlesinger publishes 1000 Days in 65, that there is a deep sense of personal adoration that has become part of his view of Kennedy. So I think it's an interesting point that in the late 50s, Schlesinger is ambivalent to Kennedy. He then joins Team Kennedy and he writes the pamphlet, during the election, and he rallies the Democrats to this cause, saying he's our greatest, prospect for liberal ideals. By 1965, this is what he writes to Jackie Kennedy, and we were talking about this before, but it's, again, something I'd like to quote because I think it speaks volumes about the way his ideas have changed about Kennedy in that time. It's when he hands over the draft chapters, 12 chapters of 1,000 Days to Jackie and also to Bobby. And he says, "My intention in writing the book is to serve the interest of history and memory of the president. This is the hardest thing I've ever tried. Please do not spare my feelings in your criticism, for I will everlastingly be grateful for your help in making this book a faithful account," and this is the point that I like, "a faithful account of the greatest man I shall ever know." So clearly his personal adoration for Kennedy has shifted dramatically, at least in the last decade we're talking about here, 55 to 65. And I would argue that adoration runs through the book, not necessarily in, overt ways all of the time, but it helps explain the interpretation and the perspective, to use the words of the syllabus.
The man's a great academic historian, but he has been brought in to the White House by the president. He has been asked for. That's flattering. That comes out of a period of American history that is relatively anti-intellectual. You've had 8 years of Eisenhower. Don't forget, and perhaps my consistently favourite and American historian, academic, and the one that I tend to go to for my understanding, was Richard Hofstadter. And he wrote a number of important books about the American political tradition, but he also wrote about America's anti-intellectualism. Now, if you think for 1 minute that anti-intellectualism still is not alive and well in the United States, just turn the TV or go to YouTube and type in Donald Trump. It exists.
So I've heard it said that Schlesinger was in some ways blinded by his liberalism, and I don't think in the context the author who I was reading was suggesting that this is a kind of unintelligent, or crass kind of blindness, because he is critical about different liberals, as we've just talked about. He's, greater support for Adlai Stevenson at one point. Then he shifts. So he is thinking this through, but he's still absolutely, to a fault, committed to liberal principles, and he sees Kennedy as the culmination of this. What do you think of that idea?
Makes perfect sense. Following levels. One, I could be accused of being blinded by my liberalism, progressive view, okay? I think I mentioned to you previously I was writing some stuff yesterday and was tempted to actually write, "Don't conservatives get tired of being on the wrong side of history?" From Schlesinger's point of view, he had seen it happening. From the depths of the Great Depression, he saw government inserted into American society. He had seen government regulation increase to the extent that it was designed to ameliorate the worst faults of capitalism and provide those in most need of help with support. He saw that happening with Adlai Stevenson's 2 failed attempts to be president. He saw that with Hubert Humphrey's failed bid for the Democratic nomination. And Kennedy became president. Kennedy knew what Schlesinger believed in, and Kennedy invited that disciple of liberalism into the White House. Can't people see how that would have affected Schlesinger's view? Over and above that, from Schlesinger's point of view, in his lifetime, what he viewed as what can be called a Whig view of history, one where the past provides lessons for the present, and 2, where human history is one of continuing progress, in the case of American history, a constant evolution of American democracy and an evolution of American capitalism in a more progressive, inclusive way. He sees Johnson and the Great Society. We see in our lifetime Obamacare. We see in our lifetime the struggle that the conservatives, the barbarians at the gate, have had in attempting to repeal Obamacare. So the fact of the matter is, from Schlesinger's point of view, that's simply observing the patterns of American history of his lifetime.
I'm going to make one final argument here, and that is I actually like Schlesinger as a person and as a historian, but I've always had a problem with this book, 1,000 Days, or several problems. And I think it's fairly obvious what those are at this point. But one final argument, and that is that I am suspicious of some of the claims that he makes in the preface or the foreword to this updated edition of 1,000 Days, where he kind of tries to claim some innocence, that he was under a cloud of grieving and he made some mistakes and perhaps exaggerated certain things and so on. I'm going to wrap up all that we've just said and say that he was more conscious of what he was doing than he admits in that revised edition.
In terms of the revised edition, I think you're wise to be cynical. I think back to trust no one, especially me or Arthur Myers Schlesinger Jr. I think in the first volume, I think you need to look at what he says he is doing and then see whether he does that. That doesn't mean that he doesn't fall into the trap of being excessively laudatory in his comments, especially with regard to Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But again, he was in the middle of it, and it was white knuckle time. People actually believed that this could be the trigger to a nuclear war. Therefore, anybody who didn't put the US or the world in that situation should be seen as worthy of praise. In other words, Kennedy mightn't have got the Cuban Missile Crisis perfectly right, but he certainly didn't get it, as it could have been disastrously wrong.
And so that cuts right to the heart, really, I think, of what we're talking about earlier, about this nature of this debate that we're trying to focus on, the man and the myth debate. To what extent the image and the substance are combined is the question. And that's really a good example of that, probably, is that there's a lot of discussion and debate around the nature of XCOM and the nature of the handling and the management of that crisis. We know that. But a lot of people come down and say that he didn't get it horribly wrong, and that's something. That's the substance, you might say, and it's what you do with that and what you say about that then maybe becomes, perhaps, depending on what a historian might say, that's where you might argue that a mythologizing starts to enter into the picture. I would argue anyway. But it's a good example. I think it's a good concrete example of this debate within history extension and how it will work.
The key for anything, whether it's, as I was saying before, whether Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage or not, whether Kennedy was a real liberal or not, whether Kennedy did ring up Martin Luther King's wife when he was in jail, whether Kennedy promoted the Cuban Missile Crisis, whether Kennedy handled it well, whether Kennedy handled it badly. Let's go back to E.H. Carr in his famous comment in What is History? A relativist position, which means there are links between question 1 and question 2 in your exam. Before you read the history, study the historian. Before you believe either Jonathan or me, be aware of what we told you about our context.
So let's cast our minds forward then and contrast this. Let's go for some contemporary sources. What's something that what's a recent source that you think is worthy of study here?
I use Thomas Olyphant. Thomas Olyphant, a Boston Globe journalist. I use the idea of a journalist to work against Seymour Hersh, also an investigative reporter and a journalist. Seymour Hersh's version is less complimentary. Oliphant does not, in my reading of his work, and it's The Road to Camelot. In other words, JFK's 4-year campaign for the presidency. It traces JFK's career from 1956 up until the time he gets the Democratic nomination in Los Angeles in 1960. And what it shows more than anything else is the political minefield that was American democratic politics, and how Kennedy had to woo so many different constituencies. And the one that you shouldn't miss is the distinction between Northern and Southern Democrats. And I mentioned this before. Until LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, the South was solidly Democrat. The day LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, he put down the pen and he said, "We have lost the South forever." Republicans since then have turned away from the Democratic Party, and just have a look at political maps of the United States. Look at how Republican red Texas is, for example, and it used to be a Democrat state, okay? You realise that Kennedy had to compromise with people who were political conservatives, while at the same time battling to continue to retain the support of political progressives. And have a look at the syllabus, because if you look at the syllabus, it doesn't have in it anything about Kennedy's domestic political agenda. They don't think he had one. They don't think he succeeded. They fail to understand the struggle that he had, and they fail to appreciate the legacy that he left that transformed the American domestic political landscape. Have a look at Thomas Olyphant.
Talk to us a bit about Olyphant's method and sources, and how does, let's go again back to the syllabus terms here. How does he approach history?
Basically, even though he is an investigative reporter, very much applying the very best of historical methodology. He goes back to the documents. In other words, he abides by the best of the Rankian paradigm. Hello, question one. That one, a good historical account is based on, first, a rigorous interrogation of the evidence. Two, building a logical argument and applying theory to explain the significance of that evidence. Now, Olyphant does that. He goes back, and where he can't get actual transcripts of speeches, where he can't actually get the documentary evidence, and mind you, there was plenty available, he actually interviews people who were there at the time, the eye and the ear witnesses. So in many ways, as a journalist, he provides sound historical method. Now, for the record, Olyphant is a journalist. His book could be called Popular History. But we were talking about Schlesinger before. Schlesinger's book, 1,000 Days, even though it's authored by an academic historian, reads to me like popular history. It doesn't pass those two tests of the Rankian paradigm. There is not a rigorous interpretation of evidence, and the application of his theory and explanation is often dodgy. So a kind of history is not determined by who writes it. A kind of history is determined by how it is produced.
So a book that caught my attention a couple of years back was the Michael Hogan's book, JFK, An Afterlife. I think it's called, that's the title. Yeah. And it's really basically, I see it as a sort of a narrative version of the historiography of JFK, really, as the title suggests, after he died. And I thought it was, it's not a text I'd necessarily encourage people to use in an exam as a source, but in terms of just getting your head around a lot of the different sources that are out there and putting them in context, I think he did quite a good job of setting that sort of story of the historiography up. And one of the big themes of the book that keeps coming back in many parts of the work is this idea of the JFK Library. And I thought he did a very good job of trying to tease out some of the issues around that. And it actually made me think, I was already suspecting this, but it did give me a lot of sense of how to perhaps use the library and museum itself as a source. A few reasons that it strikes me as a clever option is that it's not a book. The library and museum is a site, and it plays into the whole debate around forms of communication, which is mentioned quite specifically in the syllabus. It also is, in a way, it's an interesting institution because it's not like a book which is published, say, in 1965 or 1997. It's an ongoing source. And my argument there would be it's always contemporary. if you keep up to date with what's happening in the library, it's always going to be a contemporary source, which deals with the issue in the syllabus, which says, don't just deal with old sources, deal with contemporary stuff as well.
It depends who you talk to, though. I was in the Kennedy Library before Jackie died, and I was making notes on it, largely because I was focused on the difference in the version of the 1960 presidential campaign as portrayed in the Kennedy Library as opposed to how it was portrayed in the Nixon Library. And all around, the nature of the displays before Jackie's death were different to the nature of the displays after Jackie's death. So on one level, that's interesting. But you've also got to remember, and it's often difficult for Australians to get their head around this, American presidential libraries are part of their iconography. They are part and parcel of the way they see history. Because I am a nerd, and I know I have said that before, but you need to understand this, I have been to every existent American presidential library. The oldest is that belongs to Rutherford B. Hayes. It goes back to 1876. I will be going to Obama, okay? My wife is not certain that I will be allowed to go to Trump because she's afraid I'll get arrested. But the point is that each of these libraries picks out the best in that particular president and celebrates it. There is a tendency for people when they go into museums and libraries to abandon their critical facilities, okay? People go into museums either because they're on a school excursion or they want to get out of the rain. The reality is you need to interrogate those modes of making history, and in this, producers of history. When I use the phrase makers of history, I'm using a line from Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington, that museums are makers of history as much as filmmakers are, as much as portrait artists are, as much as academic and popular historians are. The particular craft of the Kennedy Library sets it apart from all of the others, and I know because I've got direct points of comparison to all of the others, in a striking way. It has become a centre not only for remembering JFK, but it has become a centre for liberal, progressive, American, political, policy making and agendas. You can go to the JFK website, the JFK Library website. You can simply type into it speeches from JFK Presidential Library. For the record, the Democratic rebuttal to Donald Trump's first State of the Union was delivered by a Kennedy relative in the JFK Library. If that's not enduring power of the legacy and maybe the impact of dollars and the brand, I don't know what is.
I want to pick up on two things you said there that I think is crucial to this. One of them is the studies that we now have actually from America, but across the world really, and in Australia as well. Definitely, I know those two examples of where people get most of their historical information and also the sources that they trust most. And it's pretty clear that museums are the highest rated almost the world over, from what I can gather. And so it does speak to that power of an institution like the Kennedy Library and Museum to really speak with authority. Yep. But when you know that it's a constructed version of the past like this, that when we're looking at it critically, there are a whole lot of issues we have to be sort of thinking about. So that's the first point. And the second point that I want to pick up on and I guess emphasize is this idea that there has become, it seems anyway, that particularly in America, these sites have, presidential museums I'm talking about here, these sites have become a kind of sacred and almost part of America's civic religion. So there's a great author, I recommend to put this in context. His name is James Hufbauer. He's a historian, I believe. Never know whether I pronounce his name right. But he wrote a book called Presidential Temples, and the subtitle is How Memorials and Libraries Shape Public Memory. It's written in 2005. So it's recent enough for me to see how this works out with JFK. And he literally calls these institutions sites of pilgrimage, where you don't go to learn history, you go to, in a sense, idealize and maybe even to some degree idolize these people.
There are two parts. There are the section of the facility that's run by the National Archives and Records Administration, and then there is the museum bit. We've talked about this before. When I went there in 2000, I got access to the library. Not everybody gets access to the library. In other words, the people who run the research facility want people to do research if they think that research will be the kind of product they want to see out there. But you're right, because in the American political system, the president is both head of state and political head, there is this deep sense of reverence for the office of the President of the United States. And the libraries, all of the libraries, are wrapped up in exactly that. The only one that was actually used by a living president was FDR's at Hyde Park. But again, people don't go there, as I did, to go into the archives. People go there to see the ramps for FDR's wheelchair. People go to the Kennedy Library to have a look at Jackie's inauguration frock, okay? In the case of the Nixon Library, they go to actually look at the reconstruction of his original birth site. That is the sort of thing that happens. And when it gets this structure and this public acclaim, the guides are often non-government, they are volunteers, and it's part of building this sense of reverence. In the case of the George W. Bush Library, it's interesting how it's constructed. It starts with the two things that you can take out of the Bush presidency that you will admire most. One, 9/11 and dealing with a crisis. Then tends to fade away all the other things that are less admirable. As you leave, it is Barbara Bush. It's George Bush's wife. Yes. And it's all about, so Barbara's his mum, and it's all about her doing reading with kids. In the case of the Reagan Library, there is nothing political in it at all. Reagan is basically anointed by the American people. In the Gerald Ford Library, it's all about his political background as a congressman and as a war hero. But it is political. Truman Library, political. Reagan Library, anointed by the American people. In other words, these are all quite deliberate constructions of the past, not the past itself.
And so that puts them firmly in, at least talking specifically about the JFK Presidential Library here and Museum, that puts it firmly in the field of debate, I would argue, because it is making an argument, it is making an appropriation, it's making a representation. Yep. And so to dig behind it, we need to know that Jackie was an extremely influential figure in shaping the way that message was told in its early days. We need to know that that's changed over time. There are many historians, and I think Hogan included, accepts that it's not what it once was, but it is still probably on the side of, to put it crassly, on the side of Camelot.
Yes. So, and when we talk about Camelot, let's be clear that we are talking about a body of ideas, not a chronological period in time. Okay? It's an approach. Camelot, I would argue, is myth. Camelot is an exaggeration. There is a difference between that, again, and let me go back to my first argument, between that and legacy. Legacy is real. Camelot, myth.
I'm conscious of time, and we don't want to we could probably talk for a lot longer, but we don't want to make this episode too long. So let's wrap this up by talking a little bit about question 2 in the History Extension exam. And we've ranged over the historiography of JFK. We've talked about the debate around man and myth most particularly. And I guess we've tried to demonstrate how to start unpacking sources in preparation for this. But what is question 2 all about in the exam?
Like all exam questions, it's about answering the question. But remember that there will invariably be linked to it some brief stem quotation. And basically, I take responsibility for that, whether it is for good or ill. It assists candidates to show that they actually understand. It assists markers to differentiate from people who will simply provide cut and paste answers of things that they have learnt before. So the first thing you need to be mindful of, when you are starting question 2, you have to have an hour left in the exam. There is a tendency for people to take time from question 1 at the cost of question 2. Therefore, traditionally, the average mark for question 1 in the HSC has been higher than question 2, even though both you and I agree that question 1 is more demanding. 1, read the question, then form an answer to that, then have a look at the stem quotation, but then build an argument. The question is answered in the first sentence explicitly using the words from the question and acknowledging the stem quotation or the source provided. And then you don't necessarily put in your other historians, your sources, in terms of the debate you are engaging with, and that should be flagged early, in chronological order. They need to be approached as they are most relevant. I'm going to use a word that used to appear in the marking guidelines. I don't know whether it still does. Pertinent means super relevant, indispensable. Who are the people that you most need to use to make this argument as strong as possible? That might be Schlesinger. It might be Sorensen. It might be Hirsch. It might be Olyphant. It might be the JFK Library. I can't tell you what it's going to be until I see the question, and then I would have to decide, and in the case of the exam, you're going to have to decide where you want to start.
I think sometimes there's perhaps a slight misconception too that question 1 and question 2 are radically different. Now they're obviously different, but they're not radically different. And why you can kind of see that, or where you see that come through, is that in question 1, it's more common to not necessarily treat sources chronologically. It's more common to deal with things thematically and on the basis of argument. And then you get to question 2 and you think, because it's a case study, because it's a more confined set of ideas and debates, then you just trot out the historians that you've learned. And I think it can stick out quite quickly when a student has actually engaged with a range of sources and then selected ones that most fit the argument. I think that does stick out very clearly, because you've got an argument, that's obvious, and that's obviously necessary. And then you've got relevant sources being brought up to be used as evidence. And it may be that you don't discuss everything about the source that you've studied. You just discuss the relevant bits to the argument you're making in the context of that question and the stem.
Yeah. The other part to that is the structure of all of these. Sound historical argument is hypothesis, what is your view? Then you marshal your evidence and then provide a confirmation. In other words, link the evidence to your hypothesis and how it supports it. That's the fundamental framework. When I was writing notes from the exam centre as SOM, I was constantly advising teachers to treat both question 1 and question 2 as historiography and teach them holistically. There are issues, as you quite correctly observed, from question 1, not just exam technique or essay technique. There are issues that you deal with in terms of use of evidence, accuracy of accounts, purpose of history. What's the purpose of writing about JFK? That relate to question 1, that also relates to question 2. So they are linked.
And the only other thing I'd probably add into the mix here, just as we try to summarize this. Again, it's more complicated than we can wrap up in a 5-minute discussion here, but the idea that the source or the stem really needs to be engaged with in a thorough way. So you often see like an essay might have a word that, obviously is maybe even the most important word to some degree in the comment, but that's just hung on to and it's popped in the essay throughout maybe. And that's a weak kind of use of the source. I think the argument would be pretty safe to make that. And so the idea is you've really got to try to engage with that particular view. And in the case where, say, a question might say, to what extent does it relate to your case study? When you're making that argument, you've got to be engaging with that source consistently. Otherwise, you're really not answering the question.
Take from the stem quotation its central idea and then develop it throughout your essay. And above all, you need to have made up your own mind. Now, your view of JFK might be the correct one, which is mine, or it may be Jonathan's. That's okay. Both are perfectly legitimate, but they have to be sustained. And the real truth is, neither of us care what your view is of JFK. What we do care is that it is your view of JFK and you can justify it. That's what this exercise is about.
And in a way, it's less about what you think about JFK and what you think about the historiography. That's the central focus of this question, isn't it? That you will inevitably develop views about JFK along the way. But the idea here is that you're arguing about how other people have shaped their ideas and interpretations and what factors are the most important in this case study. Yeah. So I think it's an important thing to remember as well. We are probably over time now, so thanks for taking time to come in here and have this conversation and write the article as well. And we look forward to seeing you at other events.
My pleasure. It's always good fun.